I've come today to the canyon here because we're going to talk in our Bible story about some divides that exist. There's all kinds of divides in our world, right? There's natural ones. There's unnatural ones. There's physical, emotional, metaphorical divides. This canyon that I'm in our town is a bit of a natural divide. On one side is the majority of our town. And on this side here is the rest of it. Now, of course, thankfully, there's many bridges connecting the two sides so that the people can come together. We can get easily from one side to the other. The lake in the Okanagan is another divide, right? From where I am, the other side is all Kelowna. And we, of course, are in West Kelowna. And thankfully, there's a bridge to get across. Well, but what about divides not just separate geography, right? Because sometimes rivers divide things like nations and countries and provinces and even cities, right? A lot of people use rivers geographically to sort of separate those countries. But there's all kinds of divides that separate people too, not just land regions, right? What about sometimes people use culture as a divide. They separate others based on a different culture. Instead of looking for bridges to keep together, they leave the excuse of that cultural difference. Or there is religious divides, right? People will look at other religions and go, no, they're not us. Instead of looking for ways, for similarities, bridges that can come together. Sometimes there's the religious divides, the cultural divides, there's language divides. There's just all sorts of divides that people will leave excuses for and say they're different instead of looking for bridges to come together. Now, we might look at those divides and go, oh, they've always been there. But even if they've been there a long time, does that make them right? Does that mean they should stay in place? Should we keep going and looking at those divides and going, that's just different. That's not us. Or should we be looking for bridges? In our Bible story today, we're going to look at the life of Peter. And Peter was being called across one of the divides of his day. But that's getting a bit ahead of ourselves, right? We will look in a moment at Peter the missionary, who God was calling to step across the divide and enter the world of someone else. But first, we got something else to talk about. Last week, we looked at an event in the life of Paul. You might remember Paul was traveling from Jerusalem to Damascus, and Jesus met him on that road and changed everything for him. Paul, whose name was Saul at the time, and later Paul, I know it can get confusing, but Paul, he met with Jesus on that road, and everything was changed for him. Why? Because Jesus changes everything, right? Everything is changed by Jesus. Now, the Jewish people of whom Paul was a part, they had a lot of religious laws that kept them separate from the other people that lived all around them. These religious laws were important because they thought they needed to follow them in order to be right with God, to have a relationship with Him. But Jesus changed that. Through his death and resurrection, many of the laws that were there, he fulfilled. In other words, we don't need to follow them anymore because of Jesus. So which rules? Which rules are still in play and which ones aren't? That can be really confusing and hard to sort out. So let's put it this way. There is two sets of rules, if you will. The first is the moral rule. Jesus summarized this law this way. He said that we are to love the Lord our God with all of our heart, our soul, our mind, our strength, and love our neighbor as ourself. That's how we fulfill the moral law. So the ways that we love God and love others are detailed in the moral rules. So the Ten Commandments are a prime example of these, right? We follow them, and then if we do that, we are loving God and we are loving others. We're not going to violate that in any way if we're obeying the moral law. Then there's the second set of rules, the religious rules, the ones that people did to be able to have God as their friend. So that was a lot of the things like sacrifices, only walking so many steps on a Sabbath day, not eating certain foods or not spending time with certain people. All of those were the type of religious laws that they thought they had to follow, that actually God put in place. Let's be clear about that. God is the one who said they should follow them, but Jesus fulfilled them. Jesus made them no longer necessary. And so Peter was getting kind of caught up in those laws a little bit. He knew that Jesus changed everything. He knew that he saw Jesus had risen. He knew all of that, but he wasn't sure. He was still trying to figure out how to live for Jesus, which rules to follow and have a God as his friend in this post-resurrection world that he was living in. He was trying to figure it out, and God was going to help him with that. You see, there was really our story for today that comes from the book of Acts, starts not with Peter, it starts with a man named Cornelius. He was a Roman official, an officer even in the army. He was also someone who was following God's moral law. He loved God, he loved people, he was doing good things to help others and show his love, and he was someone who prayed regularly. In other words, he was seeking a relationship with God. And so one day when he was praying, God met with him in his prayer and spoke to him and said, Cornelius, I want you to invite a guy named Peter to come to your house, and he will help you know me better. Now, if we remember last week, we might think, hey, wait a minute. Why didn't Jesus just show up in Cornelius' house, kind of like he did with Saul on the side of that road? Why is Peter even necessary? Well, I kind of think it has more to do with what was going on in Peter than Cornelius. But the next day, after his prayer, Cornelius followed through on what God asked him, and he sent some of his friends, some of the people he was close to go and find Peter. Peter was staying at the time in a city called Joppa, and he was visiting with some friends. And middle of the day, he needed a nap, so he went up on the roof for a snooze, right? And while he was sleeping, he had a dream, a vision even. And in it, there was this giant spread of food, all kinds of foods that I find delicious, but foods that Peter had never tried. He had never tasted any of them. Why? Because eating them was against God's religious rules. He couldn't be a good Jew if he ate those things, and so he had never tried them. He had never tasted them. They were what the laws called unclean. And Peter knew that if he ate them, he would be unclean. And so he didn't. He had never tasted them at all. But God spoke to him in that dream and said, Peter, eat. And Peter goes, I can't. If I eat, I'll be unclean. You told me not to eat. And now you're saying eat? I'm confused. God says, don't call unclean what I have called clean. In other words, Peter, learn this. Because of Jesus, the things that you think are unclean, the things that you think divide you from others, well, that divide has been bridged. It's been crossed. Jesus takes care of it. Then Peter wakes up. Now, okay, I gotta say, if you read Acts, you'll be like, hey, there's a few more words there than we read in the book. I'm interpreting a little bit for you, of course, right? But Peter wakes up. And as soon as he wakes up, there's a knock at the door. Who's there? It's Cornelius' friends, the people that he sent to find Peter. Now, of course, the rules, just as the rules said certain foods would make you unclean, they also said certain people would make you unclean. Not because they needed a bath or anything. I mean, they might have. They just walked real far. But because they weren't following the same rules. So it would have been against the rules for Peter to spend time with them, especially if he ever went into the house with them. What happens? They're invited in. Peter invites these friends of Cornelius in. They eat a meal together. They share the night. Absolutely against all those rules. They should not have ever been together, but they were. They spend the night together, and in the morning, Peter heads with them to Cornelius' house, a city far away, a whole day journeying together to get there. And when he arrives, he doesn't stand back apart on the edge of the street, not entering the ark. No, he goes in. He enters in to Cornelius' place, and he hears his story. He hears Cornelius tell all about how God met him. And then Peter shares with him about Jesus, about how Jesus makes the difference, about how Jesus is the way to have a relationship with God. And what happens? Cornelius and his whole household, everyone who lives with him, believes and becomes part of the big family of God. All because Peter began to see that Jesus was a bridge. Jesus replaced those rules with himself. Jesus bridged the divide of that religious law. And in so doing, Jesus changed everything. There's a word that we use in church and Christianity that comes right out of the Bible, and the word is gospel. Essentially, what the gospel means is it's good news. And what is good news? Well, Jesus is good news. It is amazingly good news that because of Jesus, the things that divide people aren't really there anymore. It is absolutely good news that the rules that some used to keep people apart and really that kept people from God are dealt with. Because you can't be a rule breaker if there isn't a rule to break. And so what did Jesus do? He fulfilled those rules. That is incredibly good news. And the gospel, the good news, is for everyone. Why? Because Jesus is for everyone. That is the most amazing thing that Jesus changed. That God, he came and showed us that God is for everyone. Not just the Jewish people, not just the Christian, like God is God for everyone. So all the things that we might think divide people, Jesus says, no. That person that's different than you for X, Y, Z reason, they, like I'm for them. God wants a relationship with them. That is amazingly incredible news. The God who made you and me and this park and everything, he wants a relationship with you. And he made that possible through Jesus. And so what sometimes in our world sort of becomes one of those false separators, those false dividers, the things like culture and religious beliefs and languages and ethnicity and however you identify yourself in whatever sort of sphere you identify, Jesus is for you. He came so that you can have a relationship with God. And I hope you hear this. God loves you. He loves you so much, he wants to be with you. That is incredible news. That is a change that came about because of Jesus. And Jesus changes everything. Thanks for spending some time with us this week. We will see you again real soon.